Hello, my name is Beck and welcome to a reading wrap up. I'm going to talk about the books that I finished in May and in June. So the first one that I read is actually Moon-Called by Patricia Briggs. This is an adult urban fantasy. I've had it on my TBR for a very long time, so the fact that I actually picked it up and read it is just like a personal best almost, because I've had it for so long. So it feels nice to not have it sitting there on my shelves unread anymore. But as for what this is about, this follows Mercy Thompson, and she is a walker, which is kind of like a shapeshifter. She can shift from human into coyote and back again at will, and she doesn't have to rely on phases of the moon to do that. So that's why she's not like a were-coyote, she's definitely a walker, but she also has an alpha werewolf living next door to her, and she was raised by werewolves, so she knows a lot of werewolf politics. And because it's an urban fantasy, obviously werewolves crop up more. There are vampires in here as well, and this follows Mercy when a boy walks into her mechanic store because she owns a mechanic shop, and she smells that he is a newly turned werewolf. And newly turned werewolves are very volatile and dangerous, especially if they're lone wolves, because often they need an alpha to guide them through the change so that it doesn't take them over, and so the wolf doesn't dominate them and therefore cause a lot of murders. So that's really where this takes off, and there is, you know, murders and drugs and all that kind of thing involved, and it's very classic urban fantasy with all of those mysterious and high stakes elements in it. And I read it as escapism because I really wanted to pick up something and enjoy it. The same reason you'd walk into a movie and you'd watch The Avengers or something, Marvel or Disney. It's like an escape, but you kind of know the archetypes of how the story is going to go. And I very much felt that with this. I really enjoyed it. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. And the only thing that really kind of irked me a little bit and that I couldn't give it a 5 stars was the fact that Mercy's voice was not flat, but I think because it was a third person perspective and there was a lot going on that I struggled to empathize with situations, but I was more like taken by the hand and dragged along for the ride rather than put in the character's shoes and managed to empathize deeply with them. So that's not too much of a drama, but the way that dominance was conveyed in here was something that I was like, I could take or leave the dominance aspect, because Mercy says that a lot of the werewolves are living very, very much in the past, and so their traditions are very male-oriented, especially when it comes to the pack dynamic. And she often tended to reject that in the story, but in her head, and then physically she would just go along with what the plot needed her to do. So there was a little bit, at least I felt, a little bit of a discrepancy with that aspect of the book. And obviously, if there is an urban fantasy, there's going to be new and interesting things when it comes to portraying sex and violence and mysterious and magical creatures. So I knew that that would probably come up as a werewolf dominance thing, but it's playing a bit more of a part in the book that I thought it would, or that I wanted it to. So it might be my issue with the book rather than the book being the problem, is what I'm trying to say. But I did give it a 4 out of 5 stars, and I did continue on reading the next book in the series. So that is the last book and the most recent book that I read. So it's going to be the end of this wrap up. The next 2 books are part of the same series, so I'm going to talk about them together. And I read them on audiobook, and they're by Libba Bray. They are Before the Devil Breaks You and King of Crows. And I gave both of those books 4 out of 5 stars. If you haven't heard of the series before, it's fairly popular. At least it was on BookTube a little while ago, and I'm coming to it late because the last book came out in March this year. And it follows a clairvoyant in the first book. Her name is Evie, and she can touch objects and read their histories and their pasts. And she reads an object of a boy in her town, and a scandal happens because people don't like the outcome of this reading. So instead of blaming the boy for the discrepancy, they blame Evie, and her mum kicks her out and sends her off to live with her Uncle Will. And Uncle Will runs a museum of oddities, and there's also a few murders that happen, and Evie kind of gets caught up in what is going on, the murder mysteries and her clairvoyant abilities and kind of keeping the secret and that kind of thing. And you run into a bunch of other diviners too, and they have different abilities to her. So it's a multiple perspective book, and the stakes only grow with each book because the bad guy is very much in the background of the first 2 books, but he comes more to a head in the third, and then definitely the 4th book, obviously, because it's called The King of Crows. These books I also didn't mention are set in the 1920s, and they follow different characters from differing racial backgrounds. So Evie is white, but there are a couple of black and brown skinned characters in the book as well. And because there are so many different races and backgrounds in the book, and there's also at that time in the 1920s the KKK starting to build themselves up, there is a lot of social commentary in these books, and that is one of the driving reasons of why I kept going, because obviously, one, I enjoyed the characters and the plot as it was unfolding, but the social commentary was really, really prevalent and really well done. It didn't shy away from things, but it also didn't sugarcoat them, and the characters had really genuine reactions to what was going on at the same time, and they were very quick to call out racism and also support each other. And I really appreciated seeing that support aspect in a group of characters that come together. It's one of my loves in books in general. So if it has that at the core of a series, then I'm guaranteed to at least read on and try and see what I think of it. But as it stands, like I said, I gave these 4 out of 5 stars each. I've seen some people rating King of Crows lower than the rest of the series, and the third book, I loved the ending. It really upped the tension, upped the stakes, and I was really emotional, and that hadn't happened in the past 2 books. And I gave both of them 4 stars as well, so it's been like a 4-star coast of the entire series. But by no means did the last book in the series let me down, and I just want to make that clear because I've seen a few differing opinions on the last book in the series, and in my opinion, it personally did not let me down. So I just wanted to make that known. The only reason that I really didn't rate these higher than a 4 stars is because while I enjoyed them and I liked the character aspects, I found the plot dragged at certain points, and sometimes I had a bit of trouble paying attention. Not because it was an audiobook, because I'm very accustomed to listening to audiobooks and that's quite natural for me, but when it came to listening to the different aspects of the plot start to unfold, it became a little bit long-winded in some parts. And while I cared about all of the characters, so I wasn't bored in one perspective if we were reading from one character compared to another, that wasn't a problem either. I don't know, I just found it lagging in certain aspects when it came to the plot, even though all of it at the end in each book was done for a reason. I was like, oh, okay, we're doing more exposition here. So I had a bit of like a love-hate reading relationship with this. I think that also links into the fact that I've struggled with motivation and reading during the lockdown, quarantine, COVID process. So it might be a little bit of both the book and me. But like I said, as it stands, 4 out of 5 stars to this entire series overall. Next up, I read an adult fantasy book, and it is Prince of Thorns by Mark Lawrence, and I read this in 2018, so a little bit of time ago now, and I wanted to reread it because I never continued on reading the series, and I remember the premise for this being really unique, and I remembered it for a reason, and that's why I wanted to rediscover what my thoughts were by rereading it so that I could continue on into the rest of the books with knowledge rather than just kind of a general picture of what was going on. The premise for this story is that when Jorg, our main character, was 11 years old, he watched his mother and his younger brother murdered in front of him while he was thrown from the cart and landed in a spiky thorn bush, and that's why it's called Prince of Thorns, because the violence started at that aspect in his life. And you see him react to the murders of his mother and brother and want revenge because of their deaths. And his father, who is the king, doesn't take this revenge the way that Jorg wants him to. He instead makes a deal with the kingdom who murdered his family. So Jorg is like, I don't want any of that, and then leaves the kingdom. So you see him at 14 years old, which is present day, and you see him at 11 years old when the murders had just happened. So because of these 2 differing timelines, I found it hard to listen to on the audiobook because it wasn't as clear as I wanted it to be when I was listening. But when it came to physically reading the chapters, it had differing fonts and stuff, so it was easier for me to track when I was physically reading the book, and that's why I wanted to pick up the physical book. So Jorg is trying to exact revenge against Count Rayner, but it seems to be taking him quite a long time, and along the way he's gathered up these road brothers who are kind of like rogue soldiers and criminals that have had his back, and he is at the moment going back to the kingdom because his father has summoned him back. So it's a dark fantasy. It has a few sci-fi elements closer to the end of the book, which Mark Lawrence tends to throw into his work, and as I was reading it, I found it not as climactic as I initially expected it to, because I remember loving certain things about this when I first read it, and I did really enjoy those things in the second time around, and I did a spoiler vlog for it as well, so if you want to know more of my thoughts that are more specific, because I can't really get into those thoughts in a spoiler-free wrap-up, then I will link it somewhere so you can go and click that. But as it stands for this book, I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. It could have easily been a 3, 3.5, or a 4, but because I didn't have any overarching negative things to say about it, except that my enjoyment wasn't as I expected, then I can't really rate it that low. Because as a written work, it transitioned from past to present really well. The pace was great. It was only that the storyline seemed to be like one thread all the way through, and I'm used to reading books that have an A, B, and sometimes even a C plot, and that didn't necessarily seem to happen in here. So I'm hoping that because the foundation has been set up in this book, that in the sequels it will be even more detailed. So that's what I'm hoping for, and I eventually will continue reading on, because that's the whole point of me rereading this now. And now that I've got a spoiler vlog for it, I can go back and look at my thoughts and figure out what my process was when I was reading it. So I'm glad I recorded that for like a future reference for me. So I enjoyed it. It wasn't that bad. It was a really unique fantasy because it was dark, and Jorg is very much not a hero. He does nasty things in order to get where he needs to be, including murder. So he's an interesting character to read from. He's very different to what I usually pick up, and like I said, I'm looking forward to reading the rest of the series because it's one of my partner's favourites and he keeps getting on me to read this book and this series. So now that I've freshened up my memory, I can do that. So as you can see from the books I've talked about so far, I've had a lot of 4-star reads recently. And while that isn't bad, I was really hoping for a 5-star book. So when I picked up this next one, that's what I was expecting, but it actually, unfortunately, underwhelmed me. And I read Aurora Burning by Amy Kaufman and Jay Kristoff. I really enjoyed Aurora Rising. I have a book talk for it if you're interested. And I also did a spoiler book talk for this as well because I just had to talk about it after it became a 3 stars for me. So this book, if you didn't know, is a young adult sci-fi. It's by 2 Australian authors that I really, really love, and they wrote Aurora Rising about a girl named Aurora who is like a girl out of time, and at the beginning of the book, Tyler, who is taking his cadet exam to become a pilot and pick his crew, he ends up missing his final exam and he rescues Aurora instead. So because he missed his exam, he's left with the last picks of the crew that he wanted to accrue, and because he was at the top of his class, he would have had first pick, but he's just left with the dregs effectively, and it's now up to them to save the universe, as you do. So we get to see a bunch of different perspectives. I think there's 6 or 7 in the first book, and there's like conspiracy, there is potential magic going on, there is Aurora, who's obviously a girl out of time, there's different species and all that kind of thing. It's very interesting, it's very funny with the banter, and I like the stakes and the gravity of the book. Unintentional sci-fi pun. But the second book, I thought it would have kind of the same aspects, and for the first 2/3 it did. I loved the way that the characters interact. I loved that after the cliffhanger ending of the first book, ramifications led into this, and it was really deep character ramifications that I really thoroughly enjoyed because it was beautiful development. But then in the last section of the book, it was about part 4, maybe just before it, and then obviously during into part 4 and the ending. It went down a direction that was really disappointing to me. The characters seemed to do something that didn't seem in line with their characterization, and I can't say what it is because obviously it's a spoiler, but they did something that had a big ripple effect for the final section of the book, and it seemed to undermine and go against what they'd been built up for so far, and that's what really frustrated me because it just seemed like a really hard pivot to adhere to plot, and if character and plot don't work together, then I'm out of the story. And unfortunately, that's what happened at the end of this book. I liked cliffhanger aspects at the end of this book, but I didn't like the way that it got to those aspects, if that makes sense. So this was a really big letdown for me, and I'm sad that I already filmed my mid-year book freakout tag because one of those questions is the biggest disappointment of the year so far, and this definitely would have taken that question very, very easily. So I'm just disappointed that I didn't love it. Obviously, I'm going to continue because I really like Amy and Jay's writing in general. They've taken me along for an awesome journey so far. It's just the ending that I didn't really like and a new character they introduced. Watch my book talk if you want to know exactly what I'm talking about. But I'm still going to read on because I care about their writing. I want to support them and I hope they can bring it back in this third book. But I'm trying to be optimistic. I think I'm an outlier in not enjoying this because I've seen people give it 4 and 5 stars. So I might just be an unpopular opinion, but unfortunately I only gave this a 3 out of 5. So let's move on. And then next I read another book by one of the authors I just talked about. So Battleborn recently came out and it is by Amy Kaufman. This is the 3rd book in her fantasy middle grade series, and I actually have a separate spoiler-free review for the entire trilogy because this released in June, so it's a very, very recent release, and I really enjoyed this series. Again, I gave all of the books in the series 4 stars, so it averages about a 3.5 to 4 stars for the series, and it follows a pair of twins in the first book, and the first book is called Ice Wolves, and there is shape-shifting involved, and there is a wonderful found family dynamic, and there's a magical school in the first book, and it has ripple effects and ramifications in the second and third, and it's just a series that ticks all of the boxes that are reliant on stereotypes and things that I enjoy, like magical school, found family, rebelling against a system, and that's why I liked it, because it had such wonderful support networks with friends, and it had a really key theme of bridging differences and fighting against stereotypes and negativity, and especially in the climate that we're in socially today, I think those are really important key topics to talk about, but it was really wonderful to see that in this series, and that's why I gave them a 4 out of 5 stars each. Next up, I read 2 books on audiobook that are quickly becoming one of my favourite series ever. So I read Full Moon and then also Grave Peril, and these are both by Jim Butcher. They're books 2 and 3 in the Dresden Files series, and I'm going to talk about Full Moon first. So Full Moon follows is obviously Harry Dresden, our main character. He is a wizard detective, and in here he is investigating a brutal murder at the phone call of his friend who works in the police force, and he goes to this murder scene and the victim looks like it's been torn apart by a wolf, but none of the dental records match an actual regular wolf. And because it's an urban fantasy and it has moon in the title, you guessed it, it's about werewolves. And this portrayed werewolves in a very different way to what the urban fantasy by Patricia Briggs did. So I like that there's variation, even though it's written in the same genre. And the werewolves in here, there are a couple of different kinds. So I liked reading about that world building and that lore. And I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars, and I can't really talk too much about the plot aspects and how they pan out, obviously, because of spoilers, but I've got a spoiler-free review if you want to see more, and I've got a spoiler-free review going up shortly for the 3rd book because it's already recorded and stuff, so it'll go up shortly. But for the sake of this video, my thoughts were that the plot in here wasn't as much of a hook as the 1st book was for me. It seemed to have like not one thread, but maybe 1 or 2 going through it, and then a bunch of side characters introduced that I wasn't connected with. So I like the 1st book more than the 2nd, but as I've seen in the Dresden fandom, that's a fairly common occurrence with the series. So that didn't deter me because I knew that going in, and so I finished this and then enthusiastically picked up Grave Peril because I've heard from that book onwards there is an up spike in the tension and the stakes, and I was not told the wrong thing because oh boy, that book was amazing. This started out with an author's note by Jim Butcher, and he was telling us that from here on in the plot gets even more deep and dark and Dresden becomes that much more fleshed out, and oh, he was not wrong because I loved this book. I ended up giving it a 5 out of 5 stars, and the first 2 so far I've given like a 4.5 to 4 stars rating, and this one opens up differently to the last one. So Dresden is with a guy named Michael, and we have never met him before, so when it opened I was like, who is this guy? But he is a soldier of the Lord, and he has a holy sword, and so he sounds epic already, to be honest. And he turns out to be a really solid ally for Dresden, and they are fighting ghosts because the veil is very, very thin and they don't know why. And so ghosts are able to traverse the veil and become vengeful spirits. And because of this heightened spirit activity, there is more danger for demons and creatures crossing over and for murders to happen. So that's where this plot takes off. There are also vampires in here, and it's a mixture of the veil being thin, vengeful spirits coming to kill people, Dresden trying to find the killers and solve the murders and kill the ghosts with Michael, and also deal with vampire politics. So this had a lot more moving parts compared to the 2nd book, and unlike the 2nd book, I cared more about the moving parts in this one. And Dresden, like in the first 2 books, has obviously been on point with his humor. That hasn't really changed, but it showed him a lot more vulnerable in here than it did in the previous 2 books. He was very beaten down, he was very emotional, he was crying, but he was also, you know, in other scenes spitting blood out of his mouth and being like, come get me. So the portrayal of Dresden in this plot was very well fleshed out, and it's what I really enjoyed. And I can't talk too much more about what this actually did because the things that I want to say are spoilers, and if I get too excited about it I'm gonna actually say them, and then my edit will look funny because I'll just suddenly cut from me being really excited to me wrapping up the book. But what you need to know basically is that I love the plot, the characterization, the fact that this is opening up to a wider scope, and we get to see more of Dresden's past in the Fae element that is introduced in the first 2 chapters in here, and it's really, really amping up, and I'm really, really excited. I'm so happy that I got into this series because I think there is 1 book or maybe 2 books releasing in this series this year after a dry spell for a long time, and it's like 18 books or 16 books long so far, and I'm quickly making my way through, so I have plenty of Dresden content for my future, and I'm very, very excited. Next up, I want to quickly talk about a book I DNF'd because I listened to the beginning of it, like the first 20% or something on Audible, and I just couldn't get into it even though I expected to really, really enjoy it, and that is The House on the Cerulean Sea by TJ Klune. And this is a fantasy book, but it's about this guy who's working this dead-end job, and one day he gets sent to this house on the Cerulean Sea. He gets sent to this island basically, and I think it's an island, and he meets these kind of wayward kids, and it's his job to connect with the professor at this school or something and go on this quest to fix things. I'm not entirely certain of the premise because I didn't get far in enough to understand the scope of it, but the way it was written, I was expecting it to be, you know, 2 chapters in and bam, this is one of my new favorites, and it didn't really go that way. The way that it was narrated was fairly slow, and the audiobook narrator didn't really do it for me, so I think that might be something I clashed with, and the character's voice just seemed pretty flat and not something that I was keen on, so Unfortunately, like I said, I DNF'd it. I really was expecting this to be one of my favourite books of all time because I've seen so many people giving it 5 stars, and it is a fantasy book, it is a queer book, and it was perfect to read for June for Pride Month, but I tried it and I couldn't get into it, so unfortunately it's a DNF for me. Maybe I'll pick it up in the future as a physical book, but the physical copies for it are very, very expensive and my library doesn't have a copy, so I think I'm just going to park that book for now and move on. And then second last, I read N.K. Jemisin's new book, The City We Became, and I hauled this recently and I said I'd read it and I actually stuck to my guns and I finished it. This is a very chaotic and wild book to describe. Just know that I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. So when a city becomes full of people and with ideas and with cultures, it becomes sentient, and then that sentience is beamed into an avatar who is essentially a person, and they gain sentience of the city and they become that city. So the city we became is very much the characters in this becoming parts of New York. So New York has 5 boroughs, 6 including state and island, and these 5 boroughs are manifested as people. So one of them is a guy who is coming to New York and he's just rented an apartment with this guy and he's trying to start a new life, and on the train in he gets hit with sudden amnesia. He does not remember who he is. He just knows that he's connected to the city and his name is now Manchester. So he's the city of Manchester, shortened to Manny. And he's just one of the perspectives we follow. Manny plus the characters that he meets that are also parts of the boroughs of New York City, they all have to come together to defeat the enemy, and that's enemy with a capital E. So she is the woman in white and she is starting to infect New York citizens with tendrils, and they're really creepy, like tentacle tendril things that attach to people and they can't see what is actually happening. Only the boroughs can see, and only maybe a select few people can see if they're really paying attention. Because she's starting to turn all these people into negative creatures, and she really preys on them to bring out their darker aspects in terms of racism and aggression. She's using that to her advantage to fight against the 5 boroughs. The characters that we follow traditionally in N.K. Jemisin's work are generally minority characters, so they're often black, they're often queer, and there is a trans side character as well, and I love that I can read an N.K. Jemisin book and see those minorities represented because she writes such gritty and detailed character work and I just adore it. And she did the same in the 5th season and that's why I loved it too. The character of Staten Island, Aislinn I think is her name, I found her absolutely terrifying just in her casual racism and her casual ability to throw people under the bus if they were different coloured skin to her. And it was actually really terrifying to read from her perspective because I know that that's not just a fiction, that is actually what people may think in real life, and that's just really scary. But I really enjoyed the character dynamics in here. I enjoyed how dark and how raw they were, and I really liked the way that the magic system worked as well, with characters coming alive and having to reunite to find the avatar of New York so they can be the most powerful thing ever and defeat the enemy. I like that premise, and I like that N.K. Jemisin wrote about things like systemic racism, and this is a really topical book in general. N.K. Jemisin tends to write those, and that's why I wanted to pick this up, because I knew that it would be very important and very, very interesting. And yet despite that, I could only give it a 4 out of 5 stars compared to the 5 out of 5 that I gave the Broken Earth trilogy by her. I just didn't quite enjoy it as much as her Broken Earth trilogy, and I'm not entirely sure why. I think it was the ending wasn't as, cataclysmic as I thought. It was a bit more of a quiet ending, and given that this is a trilogy, I thought it would be a little bit more deeper or darker. I guess it's like the beginning of what more is to come later, so it's kind of like sprinkled a few things in, and a little bit more on the ending. I didn't feel like the drive and the hunger to keep reading a sequel after it finished, so I think it's just like quietly set it up for things to come in the future, rather than been like bam, punch in the face, ready for the sequel, it's not out yet. So it was just a different style of ending that I'm used to, but I was interested enough to pick up the sequel, so when that comes out in the future I will definitely be pre-ordering it. And then the last book in this wrap up is a Patricia Briggs book, like I mentioned before, and it is Bloodbound. This is the sequel to Mooncalled. Again, it follows Mercy. She is our main character. She's still working at the mechanics shop because she owns it, and this time it included more vampires than the first book. Considering it's called Bloodbound, obviously there were going to be more vampires in it, and something is happening in her city that is causing a lot of violence and murders, and her friend Stefan, who actually is a vampire, who she often fixes up his bus at her mechanics shop, he comes to her and he's like, there is a problem, I need you to help me. And it's like 3 a.m. She's like, fine. And so she gets brought into vampire politics against kind of her will. It's just kind of a happenstance because Stefan needs her help. And it all unfolds in dire circumstances from there. There are definitely murders, there are bodies, there is more werewolf politics in this book as well because the werewolves get dragged in, and I can't really talk about too much of what the plot is because it gives certain things away that happened in the first book. But Mercy is still very much involved in werewolf politics, but the way that the dominance again was portrayed in this book for like the first half, I was like, ugh, it frustrated me. And I think it frustrated me because Mercy would think one thing and then do another, or think one thing and then not do exactly what was aligned in her head. She wouldn't fight outwardly against dominance, or the dominance of the pack and the danger of the pack would just be a given. It wouldn't be something that got subverted in the plot. And that frustrated me because if it's going to be in there as like a thing that the characters just accept, then it's annoying that it doesn't get fought against. Mercy does fight it in her own little ways, and there is more of a discussion about it in the last section of the book with one of the characters that she respects. So it does get addressed, and her discomfort gets addressed as well. But there were also a few moments in here that I was like, ooh, consent, because she gets kissed a few times by men that didn't signal they were going to do that, and that she didn't signal that she was necessarily interested in doing that with. It just kind of happened. And so I was a bit disengaged for that reason. Urban fantasy tends to have a lot of risk and like risque scenes, especially when it comes to sex, because it's urban fantasy. There's more scope to have sex with different kinds of creatures to you, so it makes sense that there is more risk there, and the way that the vampires were portrayed is definitely linking into that, but I can't be too specific because it'll be spoilers. But let's just say that there were some aspects that I liked and then some aspects that made me cringe a little, and I ended up giving the book overall a 3 out of 5 stars, or maybe a 3.5. I think it was a 3.5, but I gave it a 3 on Goodreads because you can't do half ratings on there. And I liked the plot in the second half a lot more than the first half because it focused not so much on the werewolves but more of the vampires and the murder mystery aspect, and then it came back around again full circle to the werewolves at the end. So I think what I don't like about this is the fact that the pack dynamic seems to just be a given rather than something that can be actively fought against. So I might be putting this series down for a little while, but because I'm putting this series down, it doesn't mean that I don't like it anymore. I did enjoy it and I like Mercy, but I think I just need a break. Same as I needed a break from The Witcher after reading Sword of Destiny. Eventually I'm going to continue on with both series, and this was just fun and very fast to read, so I will pick it up again in the future, but at the moment I've finished the 2 books that I own in this series and I'm just going to park it for a little while. I did, like I said, give this a 3 out of 5 stars, and that brings us to the end of this wrap up. So these are all the books that I've read recently. Let me know if you've read any of them in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. I'll link all of the other relevant videos because I've filmed reviews and spoiler vlogs and all that kind of thing for a lot of these books, so if you want to check those out, I'll link them down below so that you can easily click through and find them. But as for this wrap up, this is what I read, this is what I enjoyed. Hopefully I can find a few more 5-star books because I really need some to change up my reading year. But thank you so much for watching this video. I'll chat to you in the comments and I'll see you in my next one. Bye.